Northern Lights, a look at Minnesota books and writers, is presented by the Minnesota Center for the Book, a program of the Minnesota Humanities Commission, with funding provided by Target Stores and the Elmer L. and Eleanor J. Anderson Foundation.
It's been a quiet morning here at the main entrance to the Wilson Company packing plant in Albert Lea. The lifting of martial law, imposed 16 days ago by Governor Freeman after the violence of Black Thursday, December 10th, has gone off without a hitch. An estimated 150 non-union workers have passed through this checkpoint in some 70 cars, many of them bearing Iowa license plates. Again, a quiet morning on the whole, nary a spectator to throw rocks or hurl jibes. The attitude here is one of watchful waiting, with all eyes on Chicago and the resumption of talks between the company and the UPWA. Bud Meyer reporting from Albert Lea.
Hello, welcome to Northern Lights. My name is Sara Evans. I'm a professor of history at the University of Minnesota, and I'm here today to talk with Cheri Register about her new memoir called Packinghouse Daughter. You might notice the initials that creates, PhD. Cheri is a PhD from the University of Chicago in Scandinavian literature. But this book is about her growing up in Albert Lea, Minnesota, and it has won many awards recently. She has won the Minnesota Book Award. She won the American Book Award from the Columbus Foundation, and according to City Pages, this was the best book in the year 2000 by a local author. So we're really thrilled to talk with Cheri today. Cheri has written quite a number of books, and at least two others are sort of in the memoir genre. One of them is about international adoption called Are Those Kids Yours? And another one called The Chronic Illness Experience builds both on her own experience and that of quite a number of other people that she interviewed. This book is even more personal than those. And Cheri, I know that you worked on this for a long time.
I'm saying 8 years.
You're saying 8 years. Okay. And I know when you started, you were going to do something really different. You were going to look at the experience of your generation in Albert Lea, people of the 60s, but on the margins of what the culture calls the 60s experience. Right. Could you talk a little bit about the process that led you to what you actually ended up doing?
Well, I started out wondering, as the 60s began to emerge as a sort of national myth about how white kids went off to college and discovered injustice and became activists, I started to get very curious about what had happened to my high school classmates and others like us who already knew about injustice. They were working class kids. We didn't all go to college. What was our experience of the 60s? And so I set out to interview a number of my high school classmates. And what I discovered pretty quickly was that nobody was very interested in that topic. It seemed long ago and forgotten, not something people wanted to rehash. But they were more interested in talking about what they had learned from their parents now that their parents are aging, how much they had changed or not since that time of life. And so I began to think back more to what was the impact of growing up in Albert Lea on my life, what continued with me. And there was one event in my childhood that had just been obsessing me ever since it happened when I was 14 years old. And that was a strike at the Wilson meatpacking plant where my dad worked. That became very violent and divisive within the town. And I had actually tried writing about that strike in fiction. I thought about maybe doing a juvenile novel, something from the perspective of a 14-year-old. But somehow this all came together, and I decided that, in fact, was what I was on the track of.
So that's where it kind of drew you to write. Yeah. For those of us who haven't been there, could you verbally take us to Albert Lea in the 50s? Tell us what kind of a town was that?
Well, I still remember the 1950 census. The population was 13,545. That was on signs as you came into town. And it's a very blue-collar town, very industrial town, but in a rural area, so that most of the industry is related to food processing or to farm implements or something like that. But most of the kids that I grew up with had parents who worked in factories of some sort. And then there were the rich kids, as we called them, whose parents were mostly the professionals and business people in town.
Right.
The word rich really is kind of ludicrous now when I look back, because it was kids whose dads sold insurance, or they were the dentists and the doctors and so on. It was a very Scandinavian town, divided between Norwegians and Danes, who had a rivalry going. My family was Danish. I remember on Saturday mornings there would be old men leaning against the dime store on the main street speaking Norwegian, and then truckloads of Mexican migrant workers would come into town speaking Spanish. So there was some linguistic diversity.
Right. And this is in southern Minnesota.
It's in southern Minnesota, right in the midst of the corn and soybean fields. And it had a very, at the time I was growing up, it had a very, very active Main Street life. Broadway was our main street. Lots of pedestrian traffic. Friday nights were the teenage cruising, teenage cruising scene. It's much, much different now. Walmart came to town and did what it has done to so many other towns of the type. And the industry has scaled back tremendously. So it's very, very different from how I remember it.
Now, your father worked in the plant as what?
He was a millwright. So he worked in the machine shop and then went out to fix any breakdowns in the machinery. So it was a highly skilled job. He learned those skills on the job. But it was a plum job in the plant, still on the union side of the pay scale. But he was lucky to have that job.
Right. Your book pivots on this strike that happened in 1959.
Right.
Can you lead us into the strike? How did that happen? And in particular, maybe you should first lead us into it through your 14-year-old eyes.
Okay. Maybe I could even read a passage
that
would explain that, just from the beginning of where the strike starts. If I can find it quickly. I still don't know my way around this book very well. Here we go. Words, especially strange new words, fasten my memories in place. A new word cropping up in my parents' vocabulary was reason to stay alert. Mandatory overtime, I heard Dad intone as he perched on the stool at the end of the kitchen counter, absorbed in one of his ever more frequent evening phone calls. Mandatory overtime, he said to Mom when he came home earlier than usual one Monday in late October. Somebody in Sausage had refused to stay and work overtime. He'd come in early to begin with, and when he'd put in 8 hours, he told the foreman he was going home. The foreman told him, okay, but don't come back tomorrow then. He was suspended right then and there. When the rest of Sausage heard that, they stopped working too, and they too got suspended. Wilson's finally sent the whole plant home on suspension, but now they were trying to call it a sit-down strike. Overtime I had known since I was little. It was the extra time you worked for better pay, time and a half, double time on Sundays. It was time you didn't have to work, but you stayed on anyway to keep from running up bills, to have cash up front so you didn't have to buy on credit. Dad worked lots of overtime, and we usually paid up front or bought on layaway. You don't want to end up paying for a dead horse, Dad reasoned. Every other Thursday, when the orthodontist came over from Austin and Mom dropped me off uptown after school to have my braces tightened, I carried the $12.50 payment in my white bucket purse. Without overtime, I'd be stuck with my crooked Ostrander teeth. So that was my first clue, was just sort of listening in to conversation, watching the conversation grow a little more tense. But we always lived with uncertainty about Wilson's. Wilson's was always threatening to pull out of town and move down south where they didn't have unions. That was the line that we always heard. And that particular year, 1959, there was a lot of labor turmoil in the country. U.S. Steel was out. The mines on the Iron Range were closed down as a result of that. So lots and lots was happening. And the United Packing House Workers of America, my dad's union, had a standard agreement that they worked with all of the major packing companies. And so one by one, the packing companies would agree to that new contract, and they would settle and everything would be fine. Wilson's was always the last holdout. And this particular year, the negotiating just broke down very badly, mainly over the question of management prerogatives. There was a very anti-union president of the company who really didn't want to cede any kind of control to the workers, and so he held off as long as he could. And it really, as it turned out, it wasn't really a strike in the traditional sense. It started as a lockout by the company, that they wouldn't permit people to come into work unless they signed an individual contract, which we called a yellow dog contract. And so the union was forced into declaring a strike. And then it went on for 109 days. It was quite a long one.
3, almost 4 months. Well, you and your friends then were school kids who suddenly found your parents at home.
Right.
How did that affect the way when you went to school?
Well, I was very worked up about it all. I really got into this and wanted to be talking about it all the time. One of the first things that happened was the superintendent of schools declared the subject taboo. You could be expelled from school if you were found talking about it, and none of the teachers was supposed to mention it in school. So it made it very difficult to come to any kind of rational sense of what was going on with our lives. We did a lot of talking about it in private. I remember having a whispering argument in the public library with somebody one night when I was doing my homework. But it was very difficult to deal with on a day-to-day basis, largely because we had kids on all sides of the issue.
I was just going to ask you about that. Had you always been aware of this division among your friends based on where their parents worked in the plant, in supervision or on the lines?
To some extent, but it became much clearer now who was where. We had management kids, we had labor kids, and then we had farm kids whose parents were cattle farmers who wanted to bring their livestock into the plant and couldn't. And the issue for me around that became most serious with my best friend, who was a new best friend I had just met that fall. She had just moved back to Albert Lea after being away for several years. And her dad was a salesman, and he had to report to work behind the picket lines. And my dad made it very clear to me that no one was going to blame him for that he was on that side of the payroll, that was what he had to do. But there were night riders following him home, coming to their house. And what we didn't fully realize until just a few years ago was that her mother, who was the secretary to the lawyer who was the local representative of the company. And so she had all this secret information about what the company was planning that she couldn't reveal to anyone. And so maybe when people came and parked in front of the house at night, it may have been for her rather than for the dad who was going off to Wilson's.
Right.
But we had to negotiate a friendship around all of this, and we had to talk to our parents a lot about it to figure out just what was at stake here. And we did it successfully, but lots of other people didn't do it successfully. And school, I felt that school was tense, I think because I was so caught up. But not too long ago at a reading, I ran into one of the people in the audience had been an industrial arts teacher in my junior high, and he remembered it as really very tense. He said he had to be a hall monitor during that period because there were fights breaking out and so on.
Sure. Well, it's hard to imagine something that a ban on speech has been created that wouldn't be a source of tremendous tension. Just the silencing would mean everybody's kind of bursting with things to say.
Right.
And people's lives were at stake.
Both parties to this dispute have assured me that there will be no further violence. The guard now has been in Albert Lea for approximately a month, and the time has come when they must be withdrawn and local people assume the responsibility for maintaining law and order, which I am confident they will be able to do now that the thing has been stabilized.
You did a lot for the book. You did a lot of research on this event. You went back and you read newspapers and you did a lot of interviews. How did the story change as you did the research compared to your memory?
Well, first of all, I found there were events that I should remember and I don't. Like there was this huge solidarity march down Broadway where people came into town from the surrounding area. I have no memory of that, but I can remember little trivial things. So that's one thing I learned right away about writing memoir, is that memory is so random and it isn't weighted according to what's valuable and what you need to know. Another lesson was that I had felt very beleaguered as a child of a striker and felt that everybody in town was making judgments about us, looking down at us and so on, because the newspaper headlines read that way and the newspaper editorials that came in read that way. What I found in doing the research was that there was a lot of behind-the-scenes support for the regular Wilson workers from people, business people in the community, other kinds of civic leaders that I just wasn't aware of at the time. And then the third thing I found, I expected that I would get a more balanced view of the strike. And I even set out to write something impartial about it. And what I found was that my impression of the company and its union-busting stance was confirmed by the research I did.
And you make a contrast between Wilson's in Albert Lea and
Hormel's in Austin. Yeah, which was a locally owned business with a kind of benevolent paternalism in the management. It isn't anymore, but that's what it was at the time.
Right. A major theme throughout, of course, the strike will highlight issues of class difference and class conflict. It is a moment of class conflict. I find a major theme in this book is your discussion of class, which is something which is deeply suppressed in American culture. How did you become aware of class even before the strike?
I have been aware of class from the very, very beginning. It was one of the first things I learned. And partly it was taught to me by my dad, who would always talk in terms of the ordinary working people, the little guys, us, big business, the big money Republicans. So I was always aware of that division. And it wasn't just my dad, it was my grandparents too. It was my family comes from a farmer labor tradition.
Right.
So that was always there in adult conversation. But I also watched very carefully. And I would notice, like, one of my playmates when I was a kid, I had good slacks and play slacks. And when I came home from somewhere in my good slacks, I had to take them off and put on my play slacks. She played in anything she wanted to play in. She took music lessons from Sadie Bliss Cox on Park Avenue, who was a professional pianist. And she got these little plastic busts of little composers, excuse me.
Yes.
And I had music lessons from Mrs. Nelson, who lived along the railroad tracks, who handed out stickers for good work. And I only had music lessons because we had this piano that my great aunt had won in a raffle, and nobody else wanted it. It ended up in our basement. It was more a honky-tonk piano than anything else. So I was just aware of all those little clues.
Right.
And those stick with me. I still notice that sort of thing.
Right. Now, you open the book with a story that is about, in some ways, about your beginning to escape the class in which you were raised and the complexities of that. You call it the blue work shirt. Can you tell us that story?
I went off to the University of Chicago for college on a big scholarship. And I lived in a dorm with a lot of people from the East Coast, mainly New York City and the Long Island suburbs. And my speech habits started changing. I changed my hairdo. I was about to pierce my ears. I hadn't quite gotten up the courage to do that yet. But I came home at Christmas time, and I had with me a bag of socialist literature that this boy I had sort of been going out with had given me to take home to my dad, so he could learn the real truth about how the working class ought to behave. I had that, and then I had this other errand, which was to buy a blue work shirt, because that was the fashion, at least among the radicals at the University of Chicago.
In 1963, 64.
Yeah, it was right, it was that year, 63. It was right, and this was just after the Kennedy assassination. And so I told my dad something about wanting to get this work shirt, and that I was going to go up to Ward's, where my aunt worked, to get one. And he said, don't bother, don't spend your money, I can get you a work shirt. Well, he came home one day with a work shirt. It was his own work shirt, and it had blood stains all over it. And I was just stunned, didn't know how to respond to that, how to take it. We didn't talk about it even.
The blood stains were from having worked on the hog kill.
Right. It was hit from his working all around the plant in this very bloody environment. And so this little moment stayed in my mind for 30 years, and became kind of picked up other illusions and other associations, and became the moment at which I really left home. The moment when I realized my life was going to be entirely different from my parents, that I wouldn't have to work as hard as they did, that I had privileges that they would never have. But I also realized that I couldn't leave that all behind, that I couldn't go off to college and just wear a work shirt and be comfortable and not think about what it was really for.
What it was like for people who actually worked in those shirts.
Right, and didn't just wear them as a fashion statement
Right.
or a political statement.
Right. As you reflected on class, and you wrote this book is in some ways an homage to your father. What are the things, both about your father, that you want to mark and remember, but also what are the things about this growing up in a working class family that you feel mark you?
Okay. Well, I really wanted to honor my dad and my mom too, although the book largely focuses on his work, to honor him for his devotion to work, his pride in the skill that he acquired, which coexisted with a kind of loathing for the place where he had to work and the work that he had to do. And the complexity of that people can take pride in horrible jobs, was something I wanted to bring across in this book. And that the work they do, as dirty as it is absolutely essential to us. They're producing food. My mother produced clothing. I mean, it's absolutely basic work. That this work has importance, it has dignity, and I wanted to honor the people who did it. My dad did that also with a strong sense of himself as a union worker, a great loyalty to the union. And I came to understand growing up, and as I did the research, that my life depended on that union. I mean, we had health insurance because of that union, and I would have died without that health insurance. It's that simple. What I'm marked by is that for one thing, I don't spend money very well. I'm always afraid there won't be enough of it. And I can't just look at material things, material objects, without thinking about the people who made those things.
Right.
That I am always conscious, particularly now in an era of globalization, with the toll that our consumption is taking on the people who do that manufacturing work.
Right. And I think you throw out little points along the way that I think many people would recognize about words that you use or behaviors that are instinctive, often about money, sometimes about clothing, sometimes about just consciousness of the things you have that you didn't when you were younger.
Well, and one of the first things that I mentioned in the book, in the Blue Work Shirt story, is when I went off to college, I'd hear people talk about my father this and my father that, and to me, father was a church word. I'd never called him anything but my dad, or Gordy by his first name, because everybody else called him Gordy.
Well, you have written a most wonderful book that does honor to your father and your mother and people who work with their hands and produce the things that we take for granted every day.
And I did it, I have to add, I did it with a lot of sadness about the loss of the blue-collar culture and about the fact that people like me who aspire to other things have to leave.
Yeah. Well, with that, we'll have to leave you and hope that the listeners will pick up a copy of Packing House Daughter by Cheri Register. Thanks for joining us.
Northern Lights, a look at Minnesota books and writers, is presented by the Minnesota Center for the Book, a program of the Minnesota Humanities Commission, with funding provided by Target Stores and the Elmer L. and Eleanor J. Anderson Foundation.